an elderly woman trapped in a wheelchair, alone in the unforgiving cold. Suddenly, a gray wolf emerges from the forest, slowly approaching. Everyone thought it was the end. But what happened next shocked everyone. A story of courage, connection, and an unexpected bond that changed everything. Stay until the end to witness this incredible journey. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more incredible stories like this one to you. The icy wind howled through the trees, carrying flakes of snow that clung to the wooden porch of a small, isolated cabin. Inside, Margaret, a 78-year-old woman confined to her wheelchair, stared out at the vast, empty landscape. Winter had stolen much of her independence, leaving her trapped in solitude. Her gnarled hands gripped the arms of her chair as she took a slow, shaky breath. She had lived alone since her husband passed away 5 years ago. The village was miles away, and her only real connection to the outside world was her caregiver, who visited once a week with groceries and medicine. But today was different. A strange unease settled in her chest. The birds had stopped singing. The usual rustling of squirrels in the trees had vanished. The air felt too still, too heavy. Then she saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line, a large gray wolf stood motionless, its piercing golden eyes locked onto her. Margaret's breath hitched. Wolves were not an uncommon sight in these parts, but they usually kept their distance. This one, however, was different. It took a slow, deliberate step forward. Margaret's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She should have been afraid. Every instinct told her to retreat inside, to slam the door and hope the creature lost interest. But something about the wolf's stance, about the way it looked at her, not with aggression, but with something else, something almost pleading, kept her rooted in place. The wolf limped as it moved closer, its front leg dragging slightly in the snow. It was injured. A deep pang of sympathy surged through Margaret's chest. She knew what it felt like to be vulnerable, to be unable to rely on one's own body. But what was she supposed to do? The wolf was now only a few feet away. It could lunge at her at any moment, but instead, it did something no one would have expected, something that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. It lowered itself to the ground, head bowed, eyes never leaving hers. As if it was asking for help. Margaret's fingers trembled as she reached out. Was this a mistake? Was she about to put herself in danger? She had no idea that this moment would change everything. Margaret's heart pounded against her ribs as she stared into the wolf's golden eyes. It lay before her, its large body partially sunken into the snow, its breath visible in the freezing air. The creature made no move to attack, no sign of aggression, just quiet, deliberate submission. She had never been this close to a wolf before. Despite living in the countryside for decades, she had only ever glimpsed them from afar. But this one had come to her. Margaret's fingers trembled as she gripped the arms of her wheelchair. Was she foolish for even considering what was running through her mind? The wolf was injured. That much was clear. The way it held its front leg, how its ears flicked back slightly, betraying exhaustion. Margaret knew pain when she saw it. She exhaled sharply. "What do you want from me, huh?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The wolf's ears twitched at the sound. Margaret hesitated. She wasn't a fool. She knew wild animals were unpredictable. But something deep inside her told her that this was different, that the wolf, despite its size and power, was not here to harm her. She glanced at the wooden ramp leading down from her porch. It had been built after her legs gave out completely last year, a reluctant concession to the limitations her body now imposed on her. She could wheel herself down without trouble, but then what? What was she supposed to do? The wolf shifted slightly, letting out a soft huff of air. Margaret swallowed hard. "Damn it, Margaret, you've survived worse." With a deep breath, she rolled herself forward, the wheels of her chair crunching softly in the thin layer of frost. The wolf didn't move. She stopped just at the edge of the porch, now only a couple of feet away from the animal. Up close, she could see the dirt matted into its thick fur, the way its ribs pressed just slightly against its skin. It was underweight. "You're not just injured, are you?" Margaret muttered. The wolf blinked slowly, its body still unnervingly calm. For a moment, memories surged of her late husband, of the way he used to rescue stray dogs that had been abandoned near their property. "If an animal comes to you on its own, it's because it trusts you," he used to say. "That's something rare." Margaret bit her lip. She had no meat in the house. She barely had food for herself until the caregiver returned in a few days. But she did have something. With slow, measured movements, she reached into the pouch on the side of her wheelchair and pulled out the last slice of bread she had saved from breakfast. It wasn't much, but it was something. She extended her hand. The wolf sniffed the air. For a split second, Margaret thought she had made a mistake. The creature could lunge at her, sink its sharp teeth into her frail arm. But it didn't. Instead, the wolf crawled forward, slowly, painfully, until its nose almost touched her fingertips. Then it took the bread gently from her palm. Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The wolf chewed slowly, as if savoring every bite. And then something truly unexpected happened. Once it had finished, the wolf lifted its head and nudged its nose against her knee. Margaret froze. It wasn't hunger anymore. It wasn't just need. This wolf, this wild, powerful creature, was asking for something more. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt something stir inside her chest. A purpose, a reason. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't turn her back on him now. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow-covered clearing. The air was thick with quiet tension, yet Margaret no longer felt fear. Instead, something unexpected filled her, a strange sense of understanding. The wolf remained close, his golden eyes fixed on her as if waiting for something. The way he nudged her knee had been so deliberate, almost as if he knew she wasn't like the others, those who would chase him away with a shotgun or see him as nothing more than a threat. Margaret exhaled, running a hand down the sleeve of her thick cardigan. "All right, big guy, let's see how bad you are." She wheeled herself back, making space for the wolf to move. It hesitated at first, its body tense, as if waiting for an attack that would never come. But then, cautiously, it stepped forward, favoring its injured leg. Margaret's sharp eyes took in the details: matted fur, dried blood near the paw, a wound. Not fresh, but not healing well either. "You've been like this for a while, haven't you?" she murmured. The wolf let out a soft chuff, almost as if in response. She reached out, but the moment her fingers got too close, the animal flinched. Not in aggression, no growl, no bared teeth, but in wary hesitation. Margaret nodded to herself. "You're not sure about me yet. That's fair." She thought fast. She couldn't just drag an injured wild animal into her home. No, that would be foolish. But she could help him in another way. Pushing her chair back up the wooden ramp, she made her way inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. Her heart pounded as she rummaged through the cabinets. What did she have that could help? A damp cloth, some antiseptic she used for her own sores, a leftover piece of cooked chicken she had planned to eat later. It wasn't much, but it was something. Margaret rolled back outside, half expecting the wolf to be gone, but he was still there, watching, waiting. She unwrapped the chicken first, placing it gently on the porch a few feet from her. The wolf's nose twitched. Hunger battled with caution in its eyes, but hunger won. Slowly, he limped forward, his head lowering as he snatched the meat with a quick but careful bite. He didn't take his eyes off her as he ate. Margaret used the moment to move just a little closer. She placed the damp cloth near her knee, letting him see her actions. "I just want to clean it up a bit," she said softly. The wolf finished eating, licking his muzzle. His gaze flickered between the cloth and her face, as if weighing his options. Then, to her utter shock, he did something that made her breath hitch. He lowered himself onto the porch, a sign of trust. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. With careful movements, she reached out. This time, when her fingers brushed against his fur, the wolf didn't pull away. She worked in silence, dabbing at the dried blood, feeling the rise and fall of his breath beneath her touch. His fur was thick, coarse, and impossibly warm. For the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel so alone. And neither, she realized, did he. She didn't know where this was leading, but one thing was certain. This wolf wasn't going anywhere. And deep down, Margaret knew neither was she. The night settled in, casting a deep, bone-chilling cold over the land. Inside the cabin, Margaret sat near the wood stove, her fingers wrapped around a cup of hot tea. She could still feel the warmth of the wolf's fur on her hands, the surprising weight of his trust pressing into her chest. He was still outside. She had expected him to leave after eating, to disappear back into the wild where he belonged. But when she had checked the porch minutes ago, he was still there, curled up tightly against the wooden railing, as if he had nowhere else to go. Margaret let out a slow breath. "You can't stay out there all night, big guy." She wheeled herself toward the door, hesitating before pushing it open. A gust of cold wind rushed inside, making the flames in the stove flicker. The wolf lifted his head. His golden eyes gleamed under the porch light, his breath visible in the freezing air. He didn't startle, didn't move away, just watched. Margaret glanced at the snow. It was piling up fast. She shook her head. "I must be out of my damn mind," she muttered before pushing the door wider. She tapped the wooden floor inside. "Well, you coming or not?" The wolf didn't move at first. His ears twitched, his body tense. This was a test, not just for him, but for both of them. A wild animal stepping inside a human's home, a human willingly inviting him in. The seconds stretched painfully long. Then the wolf shifted. Slowly, carefully, he stood up, favoring his injured leg, and stepped forward. One paw on the wooden threshold, then another. Margaret held her breath. With a final, hesitant glance toward the dark forest behind him, the wolf took a deep breath and crossed the line. Margaret swallowed hard. The wild had entered her home. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just observing nature, she was a part of it. The wolf sniffed the air cautiously, his massive frame moving with a silent grace despite his injury. His eyes flickered across the small room, over the worn-out couch, the books stacked beside the fireplace, the quilt draped over Margaret's chair. He looked curious. Margaret exhaled. "Guess this makes us roommates now," she said, wheeling herself closer to the stove. The wolf settled onto the floor near the door, his ears relaxed but alert. He didn't try to run. He didn't seem afraid. He just belonged. Margaret watched him for a long moment before sighing. "All right then, big guy. If we're doing this, we need a name." The wolf blinked. She thought for a moment, studying him, the streaks of silver in his fur, the quiet strength in his eyes. Then it hit her. Ghost. The wolf lifted his head slightly at the sound. Margaret smiled. "Yeah, you're Ghost now." And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was living in a house that was too empty, too silent. She had company. She had Ghost. Margaret barely slept that night. Not because she was afraid, far from it. She just couldn't shake the surreal feeling of knowing that a wild wolf was now sharing her home. From her chair near the fireplace, she watched Ghost sleep. His massive body was curled near the door, his thick fur rising and falling with each slow breath. Every now and then, his ears twitched, reacting to distant sounds in the night. Even at rest, he was always listening. Margaret sighed, rubbing her aching hands together. She had spent most of her life believing that loneliness was inevitable, that once you reached a certain age, once you lost too much, people simply forgot about you. But now, there was a presence in her home, a silent, powerful presence that, for the first time in years, made her feel like she wasn't just waiting for time to run out. Morning came quietly. The sun barely peeked over the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. The world outside was still frozen, still untouched. But inside the cabin, something had changed. Margaret stretched, rolling her wheelchair toward the kitchen. She didn't have much food left, just some dry biscuits, an old can of soup, and a few leftover scraps from last night. But Ghost, he needed something more. Her gaze fell on the small freezer. With effort, she reached in, pulling out a frozen steak. It had been meant for a special occasion, one she never got around to having. But maybe he was the occasion. She placed the meat near the stove, letting it thaw. The sound of movement behind her made her glance back. Ghost had lifted his head, watching her. His ears were forward, his expression alert. "You're hungry, aren't you?" Margaret said softly. She saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He didn't whine, didn't beg. He simply waited. Something about that made Margaret smile. She heated the meat just enough to take the chill off, then placed it on a small plate. Carefully, she lowered it to the floor near him. Ghost sniffed the air. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, with slow, controlled movements, he took the food and ate. Margaret watched, fascinated. "You're a polite one, aren't you?" Ghost glanced at her between bites. A part of her had expected him to finish the meal and leave, to disappear into the wilderness the moment his stomach was full. But when he finished, he didn't move toward the door. Instead, Ghost did something that made Margaret's throat tighten. He walked toward her, slow and deliberate, and lowered himself down beside her chair. Close, closer than before. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She hesitated before reaching out. Her hand trembled slightly as her fingers brushed through his thick fur. Ghost didn't flinch this time. Instead, he closed his eyes. Margaret swallowed hard. This wasn't just about food anymore. This was trust. This was something deeper. She let out a small, shaky laugh, running her hand gently over his back. "Guess you're staying a little longer, huh?" Ghost exhaled a slow, steady breath. For the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel like an old woman trapped in a house too big for her loneliness. For the first time in years, she had a friend. The days passed and something incredible happened. Ghost didn't leave. Margaret had expected him to disappear into the wilderness once he was strong enough. She had convinced herself that wolves belonged to the wild, that their hearts were untamed, that whatever bond had formed between them would fade once his instincts took over. But Ghost stayed. Every morning, he was there when she woke up. Every night, he lay curled near the door, his steady breathing a comforting rhythm in the silence. Margaret found herself talking to him more. "You probably think I'm just an old woman who talks too much, huh?" She'd chuckle, running her fingers through his thick fur. Ghost would only blink at her, his golden eyes calm, understanding. It was companionship, a kind she hadn't realized she was missing. One morning, as she sipped her tea by the window, she saw something that made her chest tighten. A group of villagers stood at the edge of her property, whispering, pointing. They had seen him. Margaret felt her grip tighten on her cup. Wolves weren't welcome in these parts. People saw them as threats, as dangers to their livestock. If someone decided he was a problem. Margaret wheeled herself toward the door, Ghost lifting his head as if sensing the change in her mood. She placed a hand on his back. "They don't understand you like I do, big guy." Outside, she could hear the murmurs. "That's a wolf, isn't it? She's keeping it like a pet? That's dangerous." What if it turns on her? Margaret gritted her teeth. She had spent most of her life being overlooked, dismissed as weak, as someone who needed help. But now, for the first time in a long time, she had something to fight for. She pushed the door open and wheeled herself out onto the porch. The voices hushed as the villagers saw her. Margaret took a deep breath. "He's not dangerous," she said, her voice firm. The men exchanged glances. "He's a wolf, Margaret. You can't trust them." She looked down at Ghost, who sat beside her, calm as ever. "He trusts me." There was silence. "He came to me when he was hurt. He could have left a long time ago, but he stayed. He's not some mindless beast. He's family now." Ghost let out a low exhale, as if agreeing. One of the younger men shifted uncomfortably. "What if he hurts someone?" Margaret gave a small, knowing smile. "Then why am I still here?" The men hesitated. The sight before them, a frail old woman in a wheelchair and a massive, wild wolf sitting protectively at her side, was something they couldn't argue against. Finally, one of them sighed. "Just be careful, all right?" Margaret smirked. "I think you should be more worried about what happens if you try to take him from me." That got a few chuckles. The tension eased. One by one, the villagers walked away. shaking their heads in disbelief. Margaret turned to Ghost. "Looks like you're stuck with me, huh?" Ghost nudged her hand with his nose. Margaret laughed, her chest feeling lighter than it had in years. She had thought she was saving him, but the truth was, he had saved her. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Ghost Story reminds us that love, trust, and family come in the most unexpected forms. Would you welcome a wild wolf into your home? Let us know in the comments below.